Family burden? Jessica spat across the mahogany conference table, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently against her designer purse. That's what you've always been, Emma. Even Grandma Maggie knew it. The words cut deeper than any physical blow, especially in front of Mr. Harrison, our family's attorney, and my parents who sat in uncomfortable silence. I had driven 3 hours from my veterinary clinic in my beat-up Honda to attend our grandmother's will reading, expecting nothing and receiving exactly what I'd learned to expect from my family: dismissal, disappointment, and the crushing weight of being the daughter who never quite measured up. What none of us knew was that Grandma Maggie had been watching our family dynamics far more carefully than anyone realized, and her final wishes would expose truths that would shatter everything. Jessica thought she knew about her place in our family hierarchy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Collins, and at 28 years old, I've become an expert at occupying the smallest possible space in any room containing my family. Not by choice, mind you, but by years of careful conditioning that taught me my opinions mattered less. My achievements deserved minimal acknowledgement, and my very presence was often treated as an inconvenience to be tolerated rather than a joy to be celebrated. Growing up in Riverside, Ohio, in a modest 2-story colonial on Maple Street, I learned early that love in the Collins household was distributed unevenly, like frosting on a cake where one slice gets the decorative roses while the other gets the plain corner piece that nobody really wants. The pattern started when I was 7 years old, and Jessica was 4. I remember the exact moment because it was my birthday party, and I had spent weeks planning what games we would play and which friends I would invite. My mother had promised me a princess cake with purple frosting, my favorite color, and I had counted down the days with the pure excitement that only children can muster for their special day. When the morning arrived, Jessica woke up with a slight fever. Nothing serious, just enough to make her cranky and demanding of attention. Instead of proceeding with my party as planned, my parents made the decision to postpone it indefinitely, to avoid Jessica getting worse or spreading germs to the other children. "Emma will understand," my mother said to my father, speaking about me as if I weren't standing right there in my new birthday dress, watching my carefully planned celebration dissolve before my eyes. "She's always been more mature for her age. Jessica needs us to take care of her right now." The party was never rescheduled. When I brought it up weeks later, my mother looked genuinely confused, as if the promise of a birthday celebration had been something I'd imagined rather than something she'd committed to. That was the first time I learned that my needs could be dismissed for the greater good of family peace, specifically Jessica's comfort and happiness. As we grew older, the disparity became more pronounced and systematic. Jessica's report cards, featuring mostly B's with the occasional C, were celebrated with dinner at Applebee's and glowing praise about her creative thinking and social intelligence. My straight A's were acknowledged with a brief "good job" and immediate redirection to helping Jessica with her homework because she learns differently and needs extra support. When Jessica expressed interest in dance classes, my parents immediately enrolled her in the most expensive studio in town, buying her multiple leotards, tights, and dance shoes. When I asked about piano lessons, having fallen in love with music during a school program, I was told that we couldn't afford lessons for both girls and that Jessica's dance was already such a significant investment. The message was clear and consistent. Jessica's interests were investments worth making, while mine were luxuries we couldn't justify. This wasn't malicious or intentionally cruel. It was simply the family dynamic that had evolved naturally, where Jessica's needs and wants took precedence because she was perceived as more delicate, more special, more deserving of protection and nurturing. I became the responsible one by default, the child who could be counted on to understand when sacrifices were necessary, to help rather than require help, to give rather than receive. High school amplified these patterns exponentially. Jessica joined the cheerleading squad, which required expensive uniforms, shoes, camp fees, and constant transportation to games and competitions. I worked part-time at the local animal shelter, earning my own money for the things I wanted, while also helping with household expenses when my parents struggled with the costs of supporting Jessica's increasingly expensive activities. When college application time arrived, Jessica's average grades and minimal extracurricular involvement somehow translated into discussions about finding the right fit schools that would appreciate her unique qualities and help her blossom into her full potential. Meanwhile, my excellent grades and leadership positions in student government and National Honor Society were treated as expected outcomes rather than achievements worth celebrating. The assumption seemed to be that success came easily to me, which meant it required no particular recognition or reward. When I earned a partial scholarship to Ohio State's pre-veterinary program, my parents' response was practical rather than proud. "That's wonderful, honey. The scholarship will help with costs, and you can work to cover the remaining expenses. You've always been so good at managing money and responsibility." Jessica's acceptance to a small liberal arts college with no scholarship assistance prompted a family celebration dinner and immediate conversations about how my parents would manage the full tuition payments. The fact that my scholarship had saved the family significantly more money than Jessica's college would cost was never mentioned or acknowledged. The narrative remained consistent. I was capable and therefore expected to succeed independently, while Jessica needed support and investment to reach her potential. College became a study in parallel universes. I lived in a cramped dorm room with 3 roommates, worked 25 hours a week at a veterinary clinic near campus, and maintained a 3.8 GPA while completing one of the most challenging pre-professional programs the university offered. Jessica lived in a spacious apartment paid for by our parents, joined a sorority, and called home regularly for additional money to cover social activities, spring break trips, and shopping excursions. When she struggled academically, receiving academic probation her sophomore year, my parents hired a private tutor and reduced her course load to help her focus. When I mentioned feeling overwhelmed by my work and study schedule, I was reminded that veterinary school was competitive and that I needed to prove I could handle the pressure if I wanted to be accepted. The disparity extended beyond financial support into emotional investment and family planning. Jessica's relationships were discussed extensively at family dinners, with my parents offering advice, support, and genuine interest in her romantic developments. My relationships were barely acknowledged unless directly asked about, and even then, the conversations were brief and focused on practical concerns rather than emotional support. When Jessica went through a difficult breakup her junior year, my mother drove 4 hours to spend the weekend comforting her and helping her process her feelings. When I ended a 2-year relationship that same semester, I received a brief phone call asking if I was okay and reminding me to stay focused on my studies. After graduating with honors and gaining acceptance to veterinary school, I expected some acknowledgement of this significant achievement. Veterinary school admission was notoriously competitive, with acceptance rates often lower than medical school, and I had worked tirelessly for 4 years to position myself as a strong candidate. The day I received my acceptance letter, I called home immediately, excited to share the news with my family. My mother answered the phone, and I could hear the distraction in her voice as I explained that I'd been accepted to my top choice program. "That's wonderful, Emma," she said, though her tone suggested she was multitasking rather than giving me her full attention. "Your father and I always knew you'd figure something out." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You're so determined when you set your mind to something." Before I could respond or share any details about the program, she continued. "Actually, I'm glad you called. We wanted to discuss Jessica's post-graduation plans with you. She's been having trouble finding a job in her field, and we're thinking it might be helpful if she moved back home for a while to save money and figure out her next steps. Since you'll be in veterinary school, you won't be around much anyway, and it would Be nice for her to have the support system. The assumption that my major life achievement was simply something I'd figure out, while Jessica's job search difficulties required family mobilization and support, was so perfectly representative of our family dynamic that I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I found myself once again in the familiar position of being expected to understand and accommodate everyone else's needs, while my own accomplishments were treated as inevitable rather than worthy of celebration. Veterinary school proved to be the most challenging 4 years of my life, academically, financially, and emotionally. The coursework was intensive, requiring long hours of study and clinical work that left little time for anything else. The car. Financial burden was significant, even with loans and part-time work, and I found myself living on a strict budget that allowed for few luxuries or social activities. During this time, Jessica moved back home after college and took a series of temporary jobs while exploring her options and finding her passion. My parents supported her financially and emotionally during this period of self-discovery, treating her uncertainty as a natural part of personal growth rather than irresponsibility. The contrast was particularly stark during family gatherings and holidays. Jessica's temporary jobs and changing interests were discussed with patience and encouragement, while my veterinary school progress was acknowledged briefly before conversations moved to more engaging topics. When I shared exciting news about clinical rotations or research opportunities, the response was polite but minimal. When Jessica announced she was considering graduate school in marketing, despite having no clear career goals, my parents immediately began researching programs and discussing how they could help make it happen. The emotional toll of constantly being the family member whose achievements were expected rather than celebrated began affecting my relationships and self-perception. I found myself questioning whether my accomplishments were truly impressive or if my family's lack of enthusiasm was an accurate reflection of their significance. I developed a pattern of downplaying my successes and avoiding conversations about my future plans because the tepid responses were more painful than saying nothing at all. During my final year of veterinary school, I met Dr. Sarah Martinez, a resident physician at the nearby hospital who became my closest friend and emotional lifeline. Sarah came from a large, boisterous family where every achievement, no matter how small, was celebrated enthusiastically. Spending time with her family showed me what unconditional support and genuine pride looked like, and it highlighted just how different my own family experience had been. "Your parents don't seem to understand what you've accomplished," Sarah observed after attending my veterinary school graduation ceremony, where my parents spent most of the reception discussing Jessica's new marketing coordinator position rather than engaging with my professors or celebrating my achievement. Veterinary school is incredibly difficult. My brother struggled through community college, and my whole family acted like he'd won a Nobel Prize when he graduated. "Your parents barely seemed to notice you were the valedictorian." Her observation was accurate, but painful to acknowledge. I had graduated first in my class from one of the most respected veterinary programs in the Midwest, but my parents' reaction was polite congratulations, followed by immediate concern about my student loan, debt, and questions about when I planned to start earning a substantial income. Meanwhile, Jessica's entry-level marketing position, which she'd obtained through a family friend's connection, was discussed as if she'd been personally recruited by Fortune 500 companies for her exceptional talents. After graduation, I accepted a position at Riverside Animal Clinic, a small but well-respected practice in my hometown. The decision to return to Riverside wasn't entirely practical. Part of me hoped that being geographically closer to my family might finally allow them to see and appreciate the person I'd become. Dr. Thompson, the clinic's owner, was an experienced veterinarian who had built a loyal client base through decades of compassionate care and professional excellence. Working with him taught me not only advanced clinical skills, but also the business aspects of veterinary practice and the importance of building genuine relationships with both animal patients and their human families. The work was rewarding in ways I hadn't anticipated. Pet owners genuinely appreciated my knowledge and care, often expressing gratitude that made me feel valued and respected. Children would ask me questions about animal care with the kind of wide-eyed admiration that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with veterinary medicine in the first place. For the first time in my professional life, I was surrounded by people who saw my expertise as valuable and my contributions as meaningful. My personal life also began to stabilize and flourish. I rented a small apartment in Pinewood Gardens, a modest but well-maintained complex near the clinic. Living independently allowed me to create a space that reflected my personality and interests without constantly measuring myself against Jessica's lifestyle or my parents' expectations. I adopted 2 rescue cats from the animal shelter, where I'd volunteered as a teenager, and their presence transformed my apartment into a genuine home filled with warmth and companionship. The contrast between my professional satisfaction and family relationships became increasingly pronounced. At work, I was Dr. Collins, a respected veterinarian whose opinions mattered and whose skills made a tangible difference in the lives of animals and their families. At family gatherings, I reverted to being Emma, the daughter whose achievements were expected rather than celebrated, whose presence was acknowledged but not particularly valued. This dynamic reached a breaking point during last year's Christmas dinner when Jessica announced her engagement to Tyler Brooks, a social media influencer whose primary claim to fame was posting workout videos and lifestyle content. The announcement prompted immediate excitement from my parents, who began planning engagement parties and discussing wedding venues before Tyler had even officially asked for Jessica's hand in marriage. When I mentioned that I'd been asked to speak at a state veterinary conference about innovative treatment protocols I'd developed, the response was a brief, "That's nice," before conversation returned to Jessica's ring preferences and honeymoon destinations. The most painful aspect wasn't the lack of attention to my achievements, but the realization that my family genuinely didn't understand or value what I did for a living. Veterinary medicine wasn't just a job to me. It was a calling that required constant learning, emotional resilience, and genuine compassion. The fact that my parents could be so dismissive of professional recognition that represented years of hard work and dedication showed me how fundamentally they misunderstood both my career and my character. Throughout this period, Grandma Maggie remained the one family member who seemed to genuinely see and appreciate me. Margaret Collins was my father's mother, a sharp-witted woman in her early 80s who had lived independently in her craftsman-style house on Elm Avenue for decades. After my grandfather's death, unlike my parents, who treated my veterinary career as a practical choice that would provide steady income, Grandma Maggie understood that my work represented a genuine passion for helping animals and supporting their human families. She would call me regularly to check on my day, asking specific questions about challenging cases and celebrating my successes with enthusiasm that my immediate family rarely demonstrated. When I'd developed a new treatment protocol for arthritis in senior dogs that had garnered attention from veterinary journals, Grandma Maggie was the only family member who asked to read the published article and actually understood its significance. "You've got your grandfather's healing hands," she told me one afternoon when I'd stopped by to check on her after she'd mentioned feeling under the weather. "He would have been so proud to see how you care for creatures who can't speak for themselves. That takes a special kind of person, Emma. Don't let anyone make you forget that." Her words meant more to me than any professional accolade because they came from someone who truly understood the heart behind my career choice. Grandma Maggie saw me as more than just the responsible daughter or the family member who could be counted on to handle difficulties independently. She saw me as someone whose work mattered, whose character was worth celebrating, and whose place in the family was valuable regardless of how others perceived my contributions. When Grandma Maggie's health began declining 6 months ago, I found myself spending increasingly more time at her house, helping with grocery shopping, medication management, and general companionship. These visits weren't burdensome. They were some of the most meaningful interactions I had with any family member. We would sit in her kitchen, drinking tea and talking about everything from current events to family history. And for those hours, I felt genuinely valued and appreciated. My parents and Jessica visited Grandma Maggie occasionally, but their interactions felt obligatory rather than genuine. They would spend brief periods making polite conversation before finding excuses to leave, often claiming busy schedules or other commitments. I began to realize that Grandma Maggie, like me, had become somewhat peripheral to my immediate family's emotional focus. Acknowledged, but not prioritized. Cared for, but not cherished. 3 weeks ago, Grandma Maggie passed away peacefully in her sleep, leaving behind not just a significant hole in my heart, but also the end of the only family relationship that had consistently made me feel valued and understood. The funeral was a surreal experience of grief complicated by family dynamics, where my genuine sorrow seemed almost inappropriate compared to my parents' and Jessica's more restrained emotional responses. Today's will reading was supposed to be a simple formality, a final administrative task to settle Grandma Maggie's modest estate. None of us expected significant inheritances. We all assumed she'd lived primarily on Social Security and whatever small savings she'd accumulated over the years. The meeting was scheduled more out of legal necessity than anticipation of substantial distributions. Walking into Mr. Harrison's office this morning, I felt the familiar family dynamic reassert itself immediately. Jessica arrived in a new BMW convertible, her engagement ring catching the light as she gestured animatedly while talking to Tyler about their upcoming wedding plans. My parents flanked her protectively, asking about her drive and whether she needed anything, treating her arrival like a special event worthy of attention and care. My own arrival in my reliable but aging Honda was acknowledged with polite nods and brief inquiries about traffic, the kind of perfunctory conversation reserved for acquaintances rather than beloved family members. The contrast wasn't subtle, and it wasn't lost on me, but I'd learned long ago that pointing out these disparities only resulted in defensive responses and accusations that I was being overly sensitive or seeking attention. As we settled into the conference room chairs around Mr. Harrison's imposing mahogany table, I prepared myself for what I assumed would be a brief reading of a simple will distributing whatever modest possessions Grandma Maggie had accumulated among her family members. I expected maybe a few $100s, perhaps some jewelry or household items with sentimental value. What I didn't expect was for this ordinary Tuesday morning to become the day that everything I thought I knew about my family, my grandmother, and my place in both would be completely and permanently transformed. The will reading began with the kind of procedural formality that made everyone shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Mr. Harrison adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and cleared his throat before opening the leather-bound folder that contained Grandma Maggie's final wishes. The conference room felt smaller than it had when we'd first entered, as if the weight of impending revelations was somehow compressing the air around us. Tyler sat slightly behind Jessica, scrolling through his phone with the detached interest of someone who considered this entire proceeding beneath his attention span. "Before we begin with the specific bequests," Mr. Harrison said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had conducted hundreds of these readings, "I want to express my condolences to the Collins family. Margaret was a remarkable woman who approached her estate planning with unusual thoughtfulness and attention to detail." His eyes moved around the table, lingering slightly longer on me than the others, though I couldn't interpret the significance of that extra moment of attention. My father shifted forward in his chair, the practical businessman already calculating whatever modest inheritance might help offset Jessica's wedding expenses, or perhaps contribute to the down payment on the larger house my parents had been discussing. "We appreciate that, David. Mom was always very organized about her affairs. We're just hoping to handle everything efficiently and according to her wishes." The phrase efficiently struck me as particularly telling. Even in death, Grandma Maggie was being reduced to a logistical challenge to be managed, rather than a beloved family member whose final wishes deserved reverence and careful consideration. I thought about the hours I'd spent with her in recent months, listening to her stories about my grandfather, learning about family history that no one else seemed interested in preserving, and helping her organize photo albums that would probably end up forgotten in someone's basement. Margaret's estate is somewhat more complex than you might expect, Mr. Harrison continued, flipping through several pages of legal documents. She spent considerable time over the past few years reviewing and updating her will, and she was very specific about her intentions regarding the distribution of her assets. Something in his tone suggested that these updates hadn't been minor adjustments, but significant revisions that would affect our expectations about this proceeding. Jessica leaned forward with sudden interest, her previous boredom replaced by the focused attention she typically reserved for discussions involving money or personal benefit. Complex how? Grandma lived so simply. I mean, her house is nice, but it's not like she was hiding some fortune. Her laugh had an edge to it, the kind of nervous humor people use when they're not entirely sure they want to hear the answer to their own question. Mr. Harrison's expression remained carefully neutral as he continued. Margaret owned significantly more assets than her day-to-day lifestyle might have suggested. Over the years, she made several wise investments and acquired properties that appreciated considerably in value. She was also quite astute about managing her finances in ways that allowed her to maintain her preferred modest lifestyle while building substantial wealth. The silence that followed this revelation was profound and uncomfortable. My parents exchanged glances that communicated years of marriage-tested understanding, while Jessica's eyes widened with obvious calculation. I found myself thinking about Grandma Maggie's small kitchen, where we'd shared countless cups of tea, wondering how many secrets had been kept behind her warm smile and gentle questions about my work. "What kind of properties?" my mother asked, her real estate background immediately focusing on the most tangible assets. "And how substantial are we talking about?" The question was direct in the way that people become when money transforms family relationships from emotional to transactional, when grief becomes secondary to inheritance expectations. Mr. Harrison consulted his notes before responding. Margaret owned 4 rental properties in Riverside, including 2 duplexes in the Oak Hill neighborhood and 2 single-family homes near the university. She also held significant investments in local businesses, including a substantial stake in Henderson, manufacturing and shares in 3 other established companies in the region. Additionally, she maintained several investment accounts that have performed quite well over the past decade. Tyler looked up from his phone for the first time since we'd entered the room, his attention suddenly captured by numbers that might affect his lifestyle prospects. Jessica's breathing had become audibly shallow, and I could practically see her mental calculations trying to determine what her portion of this unexpected windfall might look like. My parents sat in stunned silence, clearly processing the revelation that my father's mother had been far wealthier than anyone in the family had realized. I felt oddly detached from the excitement and anticipation radiating from everyone else around the table. Part of me was genuinely surprised by the extent of Grandma Maggie's wealth, but another part wasn't entirely shocked that she'd been more complex and capable than anyone had given her credit for. After all, I'd learned firsthand how family members could underestimate someone's capabilities and fail to recognize their true worth. The total estate value, Mr. Harrison continued, is approximately $2.8 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence, too large and unexpected for anyone to immediately process. Jessica actually gasped, a sound that might have been funny under different circumstances but felt almost greedy in the solemn atmosphere of estate planning. My father was the first to recover his composure, though his voice carried a slight tremor when he spoke. $2.8 million? How is that possible? Mom never mentioned any significant wealth, never lived like someone with that kind of money. Are you certain these figures are accurate? The question revealed something important about my family's relationship with Grandma Maggie that I was only beginning to understand. They had known her as the modest widow who clipped coupons and drove the same car for 15 years, but they had never bothered to look deeper, never asked questions about her financial situation, never showed the kind of genuine interest that might have revealed her true circumstances. I realized with growing clarity that I was probably the only family member who had spent enough time with her to have glimpsed the intelligence and capability that she'd kept largely hidden from the rest of the family. "The figures are quite accurate," Mr. Harrison assured him. "Margaret was remarkably shrewd about her investments and maintained detailed records of all her financial activities. She also worked with a financial advisor for many years to ensure her assets were managed professionally and grew consistently over time." He paused, consulting his documents again. "She was particularly proud of her ability to build this wealth while maintaining the lifestyle she preferred and without anyone else's assistance or knowledge." The phrase "without anyone else's assistance" felt pointed, though I wasn't sure if Mr. Harrison intended it that way or if I was projecting my own family dynamics onto his neutral statements. Grandma Maggie had built significant wealth independently, just as I had built my career and established my life without family support or recognition. The parallel was beginning to feel less coincidental and more deliberately meaningful. "Now, regarding the distribution of these assets," Mr. Harrison said, his tone shifting to indicate that we were moving into the crucial portion of the proceedings. "Margaret was very specific about her intentions, and she spent considerable time explaining her reasoning to me during our planning sessions. She wanted me to convey not just her decisions, but also her thought process to help the family understand her choices." Jessica's hand found Tyler's arm, gripping it with obvious excitement. My parents leaned forward in unison, their earlier shock replaced by eager anticipation. I remained still, something in Mr. Harrison's careful phrasing suggesting that the upcoming revelations might be more complicated than a simple division of assets among surviving family members. "To Robert and Linda Collins," Mr. Harrison read from the will, "I leave the sum of $50,000 to be used for any purpose they deem appropriate. I hope this amount will provide some financial security and acknowledge the care they provided during my final years." The amount was generous but represented a small fraction of the total estate, a fact that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. My parents nodded politely, though I could see disappointment in their expressions. $50,000 was certainly welcome, but it was far less than they had clearly begun hoping for once the true size of the estate became apparent. The careful phrasing about care provided during my final years also felt like subtle commentary on the limited nature of their involvement in Grandma Maggie's daily life. "To Jessica Collins," Mr. Harrison continued, "I leave my jewelry collection, including my engagement ring, wedding band, and the pearl necklace that belonged to my mother, along with the sum of $25,000. Jessica's excitement was palpable, though the amount was smaller than what she'd obviously begun calculating based on her portion of a multi-million-dollar estate. "That's it?" Jessica asked, her disappointment evident despite her attempt to sound grateful. "I mean, I appreciate the jewelry, of course, but with an estate worth almost $3 million, I thought." She trailed off, perhaps realizing how greedy her question sounded in the context of receiving what most people would consider a substantial inheritance. Mr. Harrison's expression remained professional, but I detected a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested Jessica's response wasn't surprising to him. "Margaret was very deliberate about these amounts, Jessica. She included specific explanations for her decisions that I'll share momentarily. But first, I need to continue with the remaining bequests." The room had grown tense with unspoken questions and barely contained disappointment. Tyler was back to scrolling through his phone, apparently having concluded that Jessica's inheritance wouldn't significantly impact their lifestyle plans. My parents sat stiffly, probably calculating how their $50,000 would stretch across their various financial needs and Jessica's ongoing support requirements. "The remainder of the estate," Mr. Harrison said, his voice taking on a slightly different tone, "including all real estate properties, business investments, financial accounts, and the family home on Elm Avenue, is left entirely to Emma Collins." The words seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. as if the universe itself needed a moment to process this unexpected turn of events. I felt as though I'd been physically struck, the air rushing from my lungs as the full implication of Mr. Harrison's words registered. The remainder of the estate, nearly $2.5 million in assets, was mine. The grandmother I'd loved and cared for had left me almost everything, while the family members who had always been prioritized and favored received token amounts that acknowledged their existence without substantially changing their circumstances. Jessica's chair scraped against the floor as she pushed back from the table, her face cycling through expressions of shock, disbelief, and growing anger. That can't be right. There must be some mistake. Emma doesn't deserve. She stopped, herself, but the unfinished sentiment hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Doesn't deserve what, Jessica? I found myself asking, my voice steadier than I felt. Doesn't deserve to inherit from the grandmother I spent every weekend with for the past 6 months? Doesn't deserve the assets from the woman whose doctor, appointments I attended, whose groceries I bought, whose loneliness I tried to ease while everyone else was too busy to visit. My father raised his hand in a gesture meant to calm the situation, but his own shock was evident in his shaky voice. Emma, I think what Jessica means is that this distribution seems unusual. Traditionally, estates are divided more evenly among family members. Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding about Mom's intentions. The assumption that my inheritance was a mistake that needed correction rather than a deliberate choice based on my relationship with Grandma Maggie was so perfectly characteristic of my family's treatment of me that I almost laughed. Even faced with legal documentation of her explicit wishes, they couldn't conceive that I might have been chosen because I deserved it, because I had earned it through years of genuine care and attention. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, commanding attention before the situation could escalate further. There's no misunderstanding, Robert. Margaret was completely lucid and specific about these decisions. In fact, she anticipated that there might be questions about her choices, so she included detailed explanations that she asked me to share with the family. He turned to a new page in the will, his voice taking on a more formal tone as he began reading Grandma Maggie's own words. To my son Robert and his wife Linda, I leave $50,000 in recognition of your dutiful visits and basic care during my final years. While I appreciate that you checked on me regularly and ensured my practical needs were met, I want you to understand that love cannot be inherited, only earned through genuine attention and emotional investment. The words cut through the room's tension like a surgeon's scalpel, precise and revealing. My parents sat in uncomfortable silence as Grandma Maggie's assessment of their relationship was read aloud, accurate but painful in its honest evaluation of their perfunctory care. To my granddaughter Jessica, I leave my jewelry and $25,000. Jessica, you are a bright and capable young woman with many opportunities ahead of you. However, I have watched you navigate life expecting support and advantages without developing the independence and resilience that will serve you well in the long term. This inheritance is intended to provide some financial foundation while encouraging you to build your own success through effort rather than expectation. Jessica's face had gone pale, her earlier excitement replaced by humiliation as her grandmother's candid assessment was shared with the entire family. Tyler shifted uncomfortably beside her, probably reconsidering his evaluation of her financial prospects and what they might mean for his own lifestyle expectations. And to my granddaughter Emma, Mr. Harrison continued, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all properties, investments, and my home, because you have consistently demonstrated the qualities I most value: genuine compassion, personal responsibility, and the ability to succeed through your own merit while maintaining kindness toward others. Emma, you spent time with me not out of obligation, but out of love. You listened to my stories, shared your own experiences, and treated me as a person worthy of attention and respect rather than an elderly relative to be managed efficiently. Hearing Grandma Maggie's words, even through Mr. Harrison's careful reading, brought tears to my eyes. She had seen and valued everything about me that my immediate family had consistently overlooked or taken for granted. The inheritance wasn't just about money. It was about recognition, validation, and love expressed in the most concrete way possible. Furthermore, Mr. Harrison continued reading, Emma has proven herself capable of building a successful career and meaningful life without relying on family support or expectations of assistance. She has the judgment and character necessary to manage substantial assets responsibly while using them to create positive impact in her community and potentially help family members who demonstrate genuine need rather than simple want. The final phrase hit Jessica particularly hard, the implication being that future family assistance would flow through me rather than being automatically provided based on family relationship alone. The power dynamic that had defined our family for decades had been completely inverted, with the previously overlooked daughter now controlling resources that everyone else would need to request rather than expect. "This is ridiculous," Jessica exploded, her composure finally cracking under the weight of disappointment and embarrassment. Emma has always been the family burden, the one who needed extra help and attention. She's never contributed anything significant to this family, never achieved anything that warranted this kind of recognition. Grandma Maggie must have been confused or influenced somehow. The phrase family burden echoed her earlier comment, but in this context, surrounded by legal documentation of my grandmother's deliberate choices and explicit explanations, it sounded desperate rather than cutting. Jessica was grasping for familiar narratives that no longer applied to our changed circumstances, trying to reassert a family hierarchy that Grandma Maggie had deliberately dismantled through her final wishes. "Jessica?" my mother said sharply, her own disappointment evident, but her social awareness preventing her from expressing it as directly as her daughter. Grandma Maggie was completely lucid when she made these decisions. Mr. Harrison has confirmed that, whatever her reasoning, we need to respect her wishes and handle this situation with dignity. My father nodded agreement, though his expression suggested he was struggling to process this fundamental shift in family dynamics. "Your grandmother obviously put considerable thought into these decisions. While they're not what we expected, we need to honor her choices and move forward appropriately." The conversation continued around me as family members processed their disappointment and began calculating how this inheritance might affect their relationships with me going forward. I found myself thinking about Grandma Maggie sitting in her kitchen, carefully planning these revelations, knowing exactly how each family member would react, and deliberately choosing to reward the relationship that had brought her the most genuine joy and companionship. Tyler finally spoke up, his voice carrying the calculated charm he typically used when trying to influence situations to his advantage. "Emma, this is obviously a huge responsibility. Managing properties and investments isn't something most people are prepared for without help. Jessica has that marketing background, and I've got experience with financial planning through my social media business. We'd be happy to help you navigate all this complex stuff." His offer was transparently self-serving, but it also revealed how quickly he'd adjusted to the new reality where Jessica's value as a partner was significantly diminished, while my financial position made me a potentially valuable ally. The suggestion that I couldn't handle my inheritance without assistance was particularly galling, given that I'd been managing my own finances independently for years, while Jessica relied on family support for everything from rent to car payments. "That's very generous of you, Tyler," I replied, keeping my voice neutral despite my irritation. "But I think I'll probably want to work with financial professionals who don't have personal stakes in my decisions. Dr. Thompson has given me some excellent recommendations for estate planning attorneys and investment advisors who specialize in situations like this." The mention of professional guidance rather than family assistance made it clear that I intended to maintain the same independence with my inheritance that I'd developed in every other aspect of my life. Jessica's expression showed she understood the implications that her expectation of shared decision-making and potential access to these assets wasn't going to be automatically granted based on our sisterly relationship. Mr. Harrison spent The next hour walking us through the practical aspects of estate transfer, explaining timelines for property transfers, tax implications, and the various administrative steps required to finalize everything according to Grandma Maggie's wishes. Throughout these discussions, I found myself oddly calm, as if the shock of the inheritance had activated some protective emotional distance that allowed me to focus on practical details rather than family drama. The meeting concluded with scheduling follow-up appointments to handle specific transfer documents and property inspections. As we gathered our belongings and prepared to leave, the family dynamics that would define our future interactions were already becoming apparent. My parents maintained polite but strained courtesy, clearly struggling to balance their disappointment with their desire to maintain relationship access to my newfound wealth. Jessica alternated between sullen silence and pointed comments about fairness and family loyalty that revealed her ongoing difficulty accepting the inheritance distribution. Walking to the parking lot, I realized that everything about my family relationships was about to change in ways that would test whether any genuine affection existed beneath the patterns of favoritism and dismissal that had defined my entire life. The grandmother who had seen my worth when no one else bothered to look had given me more than financial security. She had provided the ultimate validation of my value and the tools to reshape family dynamics according to principles of merit rather than expectation. The drive back to my apartment felt surreal, as if I were returning to a life that no longer quite fit the person I was becoming. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of understanding and managing assets worth more than I'd ever imagined possessing. More immediately, I would need to navigate family relationships that had been fundamentally altered by revelations about love, worth, and the true meaning of family burden. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I thought about Grandma Maggie's final gift, not just the inheritance itself, but the clear message it sent about who she believed I was and what she thought I was capable of becoming. For the first time in my life, someone had chosen me first, had seen my value without comparison or qualification, and had trusted me with responsibilities that reflected genuine confidence in my character and judgment. The family burden had inherited everything, and now it was time to discover what that really meant. The days following the will reading passed in a strange blur of legal appointments, property inspections, and phone calls from family members whose sudden interest in my well-being felt transparently motivated by their curiosity about my inheritance plans. I took a week of vacation time from the veterinary clinic, partly to handle the immediate administrative requirements of inheriting substantial assets, but mostly because I needed space to process the magnitude of what had occurred and what it meant for my future. My first stop was Grandma Maggie's house on Elm Avenue, which now belonged to me along with everything inside it. Walking through the familiar rooms felt different now, weighted with ownership responsibilities, but also tinged with the sadness of exploring spaces that would never again contain her presence. The kitchen where we'd shared countless conversations looked smaller somehow, as if my new perspective as the homeowner rather than a visiting granddaughter had altered the proportions of memory and reality. I spent hours going through her belongings, discovering layers of organization and planning that revealed just how thoughtfully she'd prepared for this transition. Her desk contained detailed folders for each rental property, complete with tenant contact information, maintenance records, and financial summaries that demonstrated her hands-on approach to property management. She'd kept meticulous records of every investment, every business decision, every financial choice that had built her substantial wealth over decades of careful planning. Most surprising was a handwritten letter addressed to me, placed prominently on her desk where I couldn't miss it during my initial exploration of the house. The envelope simply read, "For Emma, when she's ready to understand," and inside was several pages of her careful script explaining not just her inheritance decisions, but her observations about our family dynamics and her hopes for how I might use these resources. "My dear Emma," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then Mr. Harrison has completed the will reading, and you're probably feeling overwhelmed by the responsibilities I've placed on your shoulders. I want you to know that these decisions, weren't made lightly or impulsively, but represent years of watching how different family members approach relationships, responsibility, and genuine care for others. Her words continued with observations that were both loving and devastatingly accurate about each family member's character and motivations. About my father, she wrote, "Robert is a good man who loves his family, but he's never learned to see beyond surface appearances or question his own assumptions about people's worth. He's treated you as the responsible one who doesn't need support, rather than recognizing that your responsibility came from necessity, not natural inclination." Regarding my mother, Grandma Maggie had noted, "Linda follows Robert's lead in most family matters, but I've seen glimpses of awareness that the treatment between you and Jessica hasn't been fair. She's never acted on that awareness, choosing family harmony over justice. But I believe she knows better than she's allowed herself to acknowledge." Her assessment of Jessica was particularly insightful and compassionate, despite being critical. Jessica has been handicapped by advantages, taught to expect support without earning it, and praise without achieving it. She's not fundamentally selfish or bad, but she's never been required to develop the strength of character that comes from overcoming obstacles independently. This inheritance distribution might be the first real challenge she's faced that money can't immediately solve. The letter concluded with her thoughts about me and her hopes for how I might handle both the inheritance and the family relationships it would inevitably complicate. "Emma, you've spent your entire life proving your worth to people who were too distracted by their preconceptions to notice your value. I'm giving you these assets not as a reward for past suffering, but as tools to build whatever life brings you the most fulfillment and allows you to make the positive impact I know you're capable of creating." Her final paragraph brought tears to my eyes as I read it alone in her kitchen. "Don't let guilt or family pressure convince you to distribute this wealth in ways that perpetuate the same patterns of enablement that have held Jessica back, or the same lack of appreciation that has minimized your contributions. Use these resources wisely, generously when appropriate, but always in ways that encourage growth rather than dependence. You have my complete confidence in your judgment and my love regardless of any choices you make." Reading Grandma Maggie's letter helped me understand that inheriting her wealth wasn't just about financial security, but about having the resources and independence to reshape family relationships according to healthier principles. She'd given me the power to choose how and when to help family members, but she'd also given me permission to maintain boundaries and expectations that promoted genuine growth rather than continued entitlement. Over the following week, I began the process of understanding and organizing my inherited assets with the help of the financial advisor Dr. Thompson had recommended. Patricia Williams was a certified financial planner who specialized in helping clients manage sudden wealth, whether from inheritance, business sales, or other windfalls that required careful planning to preserve and grow effectively. "The most important thing to remember," Patricia explained during our first meeting, "is that you don't need to make any major decisions immediately. Your grandmother structured these assets very conservatively, so they'll continue generating steady income while you take time to understand your options and develop long-term strategies." Her calm, professional approach helped counteract the sense of urgency I'd been feeling about proving myself worthy of Grandma Maggie's trust. The rental properties were all occupied by long-term tenants paying market-rate rents, generating approximately $8,000 monthly in net income after maintenance and property management expenses. The business investments were similarly stable, providing dividend income that had grown consistently over the years Grandma Maggie had held them. Combined with her various financial accounts, the inheritance provided enough passive income to support a comfortable lifestyle without touching the principal amounts. "Your grandmother was remarkably astute about balancing growth with security," Patricia observed as we reviewed the portfolio details. "These aren't flashy investments that promise dramatic returns, but they're solid, diversified holdings that have weathered multiple economic cycles successfully." She clearly prioritized building wealth that could be sustained over generations, rather than maximized for short-term gains. Understanding the financial details helped me appreciate both the magnitude of Grandma Maggie's achievement in building this wealth and the responsibility she'd entrusted to me in preserving and, potentially, growing it further. These weren't lottery winnings or inherited money that carried no expectations, but carefully accumulated assets that represented decades of intelligent decision-making and patient long-term planning. During this same period, I began receiving phone calls from family members whose communication patterns revealed their evolving strategies for managing our changed relationships. My parents called every few days, ostensibly to check on my well-being, but actually to gather information about my inheritance plans and gauge my receptiveness to requests for financial assistance that hadn't yet been directly made. "We're just worried about you handling all this responsibility alone," my mother said during one such conversation. "Maybe it would be helpful if we could meet with your financial advisor together, as a family, to make sure you're getting good guidance." The suggestion that I needed family oversight of my financial decisions was particularly ironic, given that none of them had ever asked for my input on their own money management choices. Jessica's approach was more direct, but equally transparent in its motivations. She called to apologize for her reaction during the will reading, claiming that shock and grief had caused her to respond poorly to unexpected news. "I've been thinking about Grandma's letter," she said, though I hadn't mentioned the private correspondence to anyone. "And I understand why she made the choices she did. I'm actually happy for you, Emma. You deserve this recognition after everything you've done for the family." Her sudden shift from calling me a family burden to expressing happiness about my inheritance was so obviously calculated that it would have been insulting if it weren't so desperately transparent. The conversation continued with subtle inquiries about my plans for the properties and whether I might need help managing rentals or making investment decisions, offers of assistance that barely concealed requests for involvement and potential benefit. Tyler's calls were the most brazenly opportunistic, presenting himself as a potential business partner who could help me leverage social media marketing to maximize property values and rental income. His detailed proposals for using his online platform to promote my rental properties revealed that he'd spent considerable time researching real estate investment strategies, apparently hoping to position himself as an essential collaborator in managing my inheritance. "The thing about property management," Tyler explained with the confident authority of someone who had never actually managed properties, "is that it's all about building brand recognition and online presence. I could create content showcasing your rentals, build waiting lists of potential tenants, maybe even develop some kind of lifestyle brand around the whole portfolio." His enthusiasm for involving himself in my financial affairs was matched only by his complete lack of relevant experience or expertise. The most challenging conversations came from my father, who approached the situation with the methodical persistence of someone accustomed to being the family's financial authority. He requested meetings to discuss estate planning strategies and tax optimization opportunities that he felt qualified to advise on based on his insurance industry experience. When I politely declined these offers of guidance, explaining that I was working with professional advisors, his responses revealed frustration with being excluded from decisions he clearly felt he should be involved in making. "Emma, I understand that you want to be independent," he said during one particularly tense phone conversation. "But managing this level of wealth requires experience and knowledge that take years to develop. I've been handling complex financial matters my entire career. It would be irresponsible not to take advantage of family expertise when it's available." The implication that my judgment couldn't be trusted with important decisions echoed decades of being treated as less capable than I'd repeatedly proven myself to be. These conversations revealed how difficult it was for my family members to accept that our roles had fundamentally changed, that I was no longer the daughter who needed guidance and oversight, but the family member with the resources and independence to make my own choices about everything from investment strategies to charitable giving. Their offers of help consistently came with expectations of involvement and influence that I wasn't willing to grant. At the veterinary clinic, my colleagues' reactions to news of my inheritance provided a stark contrast to my family's calculated responses. Dr. Thompson was genuinely happy about my good fortune, immediately understanding that financial security would allow me to focus on the aspects of veterinary medicine I found most fulfilling, rather than worrying about student loan payments and living expenses. "This opens up so many possibilities for you," he said when I explained my situation. "You could pursue additional specialization training, maybe develop that mobile veterinary service you've mentioned, or even consider opening your own practice someday. Having financial freedom means you can make career decisions based on what excites you professionally, rather than what pays the bills." Sarah Martinez was equally enthusiastic, but also provided valuable perspective on managing sudden wealth and changed family dynamics. Her medical training included psychology rotations that had taught her about family systems and how money often revealed underlying relationship patterns that had been hidden by economic necessity. "The thing about inheritances like this," Sarah explained over coffee one afternoon, "is that they don't really change people's fundamental character, but they do remove the external constraints that forced everyone to maintain polite facades. Your family members are probably showing you who they've always been, but previously they needed to stay on your good side for emotional rather than financial reasons." Her observation helped me understand that Jessica's sudden calls and Tyler's business proposals weren't entirely opportunistic responses to my changed circumstances, but rather more honest expressions of how they'd always viewed relationships in terms of potential personal benefit. The inheritance had simply made their transactional approach to family connections more obvious and immediate. "What's really interesting," Sarah continued, "is how your grandmother used her will to force everyone to confront the real dynamics that had been operating under the surface for years. She basically held up a mirror that showed each person exactly how their behavior had been perceived and evaluated by someone who was watching carefully but not participating in the daily drama." This perspective helped me appreciate Grandma Maggie's inheritance decisions as something more sophisticated than simple favoritism or reward for good behavior. She'd created a situation that would require each family member to examine their own motivations and decide whether they wanted to build genuine relationships based on mutual respect or continue operating according to the transactional patterns that had previously defined our interactions. The most significant development during this period was my growing friendship with Mrs. Eleanor Chen, one of Grandma Maggie's longtime neighbors who had become something of a confidant during my frequent visits to Elm Avenue. Eleanor was a retired teacher in her 70s who had known my grandmother for over 20 years and had observed our family interactions from the unique perspective of an outsider who cared about Grandma Maggie's well-being. "Your grandmother talked about you constantly," Eleanor told me one afternoon when I encountered her working in her garden next door to what was now my house. "She was so proud of your veterinary career, your independence, the way you'd built a meaningful life despite not receiving the same support as your sister. She used to say that you reminded her of herself at your age, determined to succeed on your own terms regardless of other people's expectations." Eleanor's stories about Grandma Maggie's private thoughts and observations provided insights into how carefully she'd been monitoring our family relationships and how deliberately she'd planned the inheritance distribution to address what she saw as fundamental imbalances in treatment and appreciation. "She was particularly concerned about Jessica," Eleanor continued, "not because she disliked her, but because she could see how being handed everything was preventing her from developing real strength and independence. Margaret hoped that seeing you inherit the bulk of the estate might motivate Jessica to start building her own achievements rather than depending on family advantages." These conversations helped me understand that Grandma Maggie's will wasn't intended as punishment for Jessica or reward for me, but as an intervention designed to promote healthier relationship patterns and individual growth for everyone involved. She'd used her final act of authority to create circumstances that would either improve family dynamics or reveal their fundamental unsustainability. As the second week following the will reading began, I faced my first real test of how to handle family financial requests when Jessica called to ask if I might be willing to help with her wedding expenses. The conversation was carefully choreographed, beginning with genuine-sounding inquiries about my well-being and expressions of concern about the stress I must be feeling from managing such significant new responsibilities. "Tyler and I have been talking," Jessica said, her tone carefully casual. "And we're wondering if you might be interested in contributing to our wedding as a kind of family investment. We're planning something really beautiful that would bring everyone together and create positive memories during this difficult time after losing Grandma." Her request was sophisticated in its emotional manipulation, framing financial assistance as family investment and positioning their wedding as a healing opportunity rather than a personal celebration that required my funding. The suggestion that paying for their festivities would somehow honor Grandma Maggie's memory was particularly manipulative, given that Grandma Maggie had explicitly chosen not to provide Jessica with wedding funding through her inheritance. "How much are you thinking about as a contribution?" I asked, curious about whether their expectations had been adjusted to acknowledge my new financial position or remained consistent with their previous assumptions about my modest resources. Jessica's answer revealed that they'd calculated their request based on my inheritance rather than my previous financial capacity. "We were hoping for maybe $40,000 or $50,000, enough to cover the venue and catering for a really memorable celebration. Obviously, we'd want you to be involved in the planning so it feels like a true family event rather than just our personal party." The amount was significant, representing nearly twice what Jessica had inherited from Grandma Maggie, and suggesting that she viewed my wealth as a family resource to be shared rather than personal assets that I could choose to deploy according to my own priorities and values. The offer to involve me in wedding planning was clearly intended to make the financial request feel like a collaborative opportunity rather than a simple ask for money. "That's a substantial amount, Jessica," I replied, keeping my voice neutral, while I considered how to respond in a way that might promote genuine growth rather than continued dependency. "I'd need to understand more about your budget and why you feel comfortable asking me to fund your wedding, rather than planning something within your own financial means." My question prompted defensive responses about wedding costs being unavoidably expensive and family traditions of supporting major celebrations. Arguments that revealed how fundamentally Jessica misunderstood both my character and the lessons Grandma Maggie had tried to teach through her inheritance decisions. The conversation ended without commitments on my part, but with clear expectations on Jessica's part that family loyalty would ultimately compel me to provide the requested funding. Her assumption that my inheritance created obligations to support her lifestyle choices showed how little she understood about the kind of person Grandma Maggie had chosen to entrust with significant resources. That evening, I sat in Grandma Maggie's kitchen, now my kitchen, thinking about the intersection of family love, financial power, and personal responsibility that would define every relationship decision I made going forward. Her inheritance had given me more than money. It had provided the tools to establish healthy boundaries and the financial independence to maintain those boundaries regardless of family pressure or emotional manipulation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as I continued navigating the complex dynamics of sudden wealth and changed family roles. But tonight, I felt grateful for the wisdom Grandma Maggie had demonstrated in choosing someone who would protect rather than squander the legacy she'd worked so hard to build. The family burden had become the family foundation, and that transformation was just beginning to reshape everything about how we related to each other. The morning I decided to address Jessica's wedding funding request marked a turning point in how I understood my role as the inheritor of Grandma Maggie's wealth and values. Instead of simply declining or agreeing to her financial demands, I chose to create an opportunity for genuine conversation about family relationships, personal responsibility, and what it meant to truly support someone's growth rather than enable their dependencies. I invited Jessica to meet me at Grandma Maggie's house for what I described as a conversation about family and future plans. She arrived with obvious excitement, probably interpreting the invitation as a positive response to her wedding funding request. Tyler accompanied her, despite my having invited only Jessica. His presence clearly intended to provide support for whatever negotiation he anticipated occurring. "This place feels so different knowing it's yours now," Jessica said as we settled in the living room that had hosted countless family gatherings over the years. "It's weird thinking about Grandma not being here, but also kind of exciting imagining what you might do with all this space." Her comment revealed the casual way she'd begun thinking about my inheritance as an extension of family resources rather than personal assets that came with individual responsibility. Tyler immediately began analyzing the house's potential for renovation and modernization, offering unsolicited suggestions about open floor plans and updated kitchens that could really maximize the property value and rental potential. His presumption that he should be involved in planning modifications to my inherited home was characteristic of how he'd begun positioning himself as a collaborative partner in managing wealth that had nothing to do with him. "Actually," I said, interrupting his impromptu renovation consultation, "I wanted to talk with you both about something more fundamental than property improvements or wedding funding. I've been thinking about what Grandma Maggie was trying to achieve with her inheritance decisions and what responsibilities come with the trust she placed in me." My tone was serious enough to capture their attention and signal that this wasn't going to be the straightforward financial negotiation they'd expected. Jessica's expression shifted from excitement to wariness as she recognized that my invitation might not lead to the outcome she'd anticipated. "Okay, but Emma, before we get into heavy family stuff, can we talk about the wedding timeline? We need to put deposits down soon, and the venue we want is really popular. If you're going to help us, we kind of need to know so we can move forward with planning." Her immediate return to wedding logistics revealed how single-minded she'd become, about securing my financial support, treating our conversation as an obstacle to navigate rather than an opportunity for meaningful family discussion. Tyler nodded agreement, adding his own sense of urgency about locking in vendors and taking advantage of current pricing that suggested they'd already begun making commitments based on assumed access to my inheritance. "That's exactly what I want to discuss," I replied calmly. "The way we approach this wedding request is going to set the pattern for how we handle family financial matters going forward. I want to make sure we establish expectations and boundaries that actually strengthen our relationships rather than creating resentment or dependency." My words were carefully chosen to frame the conversation around family health rather than simply declining their request. I reached for the folder I'd prepared containing printed copies of several documents, including excerpts from Grandma Maggie's letter to me and a financial proposal I'd developed after consulting with Patricia Williams about appropriate ways to support family members without enabling unhealthy patterns. "Grandma Maggie left me a letter explaining her inheritance decisions," I began, watching Jessica's reaction to this revelation. She wrote about each family member individually, sharing her observations about our character development and her hopes for how this inheritance might promote positive growth for everyone involved. Jessica's curiosity was obvious, though Tyler looked less interested in family psychology and more focused on potential financial implications. I read selected portions of Grandma Maggie's letter aloud, including her assessment of Jessica as someone who had been handicapped by advantages, and her hope that seeing merit-based inheritance distribution might motivate Jessica to develop greater independence and self-reliance. Jessica listened with growing discomfort, clearly recognizing the accuracy of observations she'd probably never considered from an external perspective. She also wrote about the importance of using this wealth to encourage growth rather than dependence, I continued, and she specifically trusted my judgment about when and how to help family members in ways that promote their long-term development rather than short-term comfort. The implication that my assistance would come with expectations and boundaries was beginning to register with both Jessica and Tyler. "Look, Emma," Tyler interjected, "I respect what your grandmother thought, but that was written before she knew about our wedding plans or understood the kind of opportunities we're trying to create. Sometimes you have to invest in relationships and celebrations that bring families together, especially during difficult times like losing a family matriarch. His attempt to reframe their wedding as grief counseling was transparently manipulative, but it also revealed his sophisticated understanding of emotional leverage techniques. Jessica nodded emphatically, building on Tyler's argument. Exactly. This wedding isn't just about us. It's about creating positive family memories and giving everyone something to celebrate instead of focusing on loss and conflict. Grandma would have wanted the family to come together, and our wedding could be exactly the kind of healing event that honors her memory. Their coordinated appeal demonstrated they'd prepared for this conversation, anticipating resistance and developing arguments designed to make declining their request seem selfish and disrespectful to Grandma Maggie's memory. The irony of using her memory to justify behavior she'd explicitly criticized in her letter was striking, but I recognized the desperation underlying their manipulation attempts. "I understand you want this wedding to be special," I said, maintaining calm despite their emotional pressure tactics. "And I do want to support your marriage and happiness, but I think there's a better way to do that than simply funding an expensive celebration that you can't afford independently." I opened the folder and removed the proposal I'd developed with Patricia's guidance, a structured approach to family financial assistance that promoted growth while providing meaningful support. What I'm proposing is a wedding gift of $10,000, along with a matching contribution to a savings account that you would establish and fund monthly for the first year of your marriage. If you save $500 per month for 12 months, I'll match that amount, giving you an additional $6,000 to use for your first home down payment or other significant life investments. The proposal was designed to provide substantial assistance while requiring Jessica and Tyler to demonstrate financial discipline and planning skills that would serve their marriage well long-term. The total potential gift of $16,000 was generous, but came with expectations that they develop the kind of responsible money management habits that Grandma Maggie had valued. Jessica's reaction was immediate and negative. $10,000? Emma, we were hoping for enough to actually cover major wedding expenses, not just a partial contribution that doesn't really solve anything, and making us jump through hoops. With savings requirements feels like you're treating us like children who need to prove ourselves worthy of family support. Tyler's response was more strategic, attempting to negotiate rather than simply complaining about the offer. The savings match program is interesting, but the timeline doesn't work for wedding planning. Could we modify it so the matching funds are available immediately for wedding expenses, with the monthly savings requirement starting after the honeymoon? His counter-proposal revealed he understood the concept, but wanted to eliminate the accountability aspects that made it meaningful. The structure is intentional, I explained patiently. The goal isn't just to give you money, but to help you develop financial habits that will strengthen your marriage and prepare you for long-term success. Grandma Maggie built her wealth through decades of careful planning and disciplined saving. These same principles can help you build your own financial foundation. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Jessica and Tyler alternating between accepting my proposal reluctantly and arguing for modifications that would provide immediate access to larger amounts without ongoing accountability requirements. Their resistance to any conditions or expectations revealed how fundamentally they misunderstood both my character and the lessons Grandma Maggie had tried to teach through her inheritance decisions. "This feels like you're using money to control our choices," Jessica finally said, her frustration boiling over into direct accusation. "Grandma left you that inheritance because she trusted your judgment, not because she wanted you to become some kind of family financial dictator who makes everyone prove themselves worthy of assistance." Her characterization of structured support as financial dictatorship showed how unprepared she was for any relationship that involved reciprocal responsibility. "Jessica," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite her emotional manipulation, "I'm offering you $16,000 in wedding and marriage support, which is more than Grandma Maggie gave you in her will. and significantly more than most siblings provide for each other's weddings. The only requirement is that you demonstrate the same kind of financial responsibility that allowed me to build a stable life, and that enabled Grandma Maggie to accumulate the wealth I inherited. Tyler attempted one final negotiation, suggesting that they accept the $10,000 immediate gift, but modify the savings match program to require only 3 months of demonstrated saving rather than 12. We're basically asking you to trust that we're capable of financial responsibility without making us prove it for an entire year, he argued. Surely 6 months would be enough time to demonstrate our commitment to building good money management habits. His willingness to negotiate timeframes while maintaining resistance to accountability revealed that he viewed my proposal as a temporary obstacle to overcome rather than a genuine opportunity to develop beneficial habits. Jessica nodded agreement with his modified proposal, treating it as a reasonable compromise that split the difference between my expectations and their preferences. The 12-month timeline is important, I maintained, because developing sustainable habits requires consistent practice over time. Anyone can save money for 3 or 6 months, especially when there's a financial reward waiting. Demonstrating discipline for a full year shows genuine commitment to changed behavior patterns that will benefit your marriage regardless of my financial involvement. Their continued resistance to meaningful accountability requirements confirmed that they viewed my inheritance as a family resource to be accessed rather than personal assets that I could choose to deploy according to principles that reflected Grandma Maggie's values and my own judgment. This fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of our changed relationship would need to be addressed directly if we were going to establish healthy boundaries going forward. As our conversation concluded without agreement on wedding funding, I realized that Jessica and Tyler's reactions had provided valuable information about their priorities and character that would influence all future family financial decisions. Their immediate focus on maximizing immediate benefit while minimizing ongoing responsibility suggested they weren't ready for the kind of supportive relationship I was prepared to offer. The following week brought similar conversations with my parents, who requested a meeting to discuss family financial planning that turned out to be their own attempt to gain influence over my inheritance management decisions. Unlike Jessica's direct request for wedding funding, their approach was more sophisticated, focusing on tax optimization strategies and estate planning considerations that they believed justified their involvement in my financial affairs. Emma, we're concerned about the tax implications of holding this much property and investment income without proper planning, my father explained during our meeting at their kitchen table. There are strategies for maximizing long-term wealth preservation that require family coordination and might benefit from spreading some assets across multiple family members to optimize tax brackets. His suggestion that I distribute portions of my inheritance to other family members for tax purposes was transparently motivated by their own financial desires, but it was presented with the kind of technical authority that had intimidated me throughout childhood when I lacked the knowledge to evaluate his claims independently. Fortunately, my recent consultations with Patricia Williams had provided me with sufficient understanding of tax law and estate planning to recognize that my father's suggestions were either incorrect or designed to benefit other family members at my expense. The inheritance was structured in ways that already optimized tax efficiency, and the strategies he proposed would actually increase my tax burden while providing financial benefits to recipients who hadn't earned them. I appreciate your concern about tax planning, I replied diplomatically. But I've been working with qualified estate planning professionals who've confirmed that Grandma Maggie structured these assets very efficiently. The current arrangement provides excellent tax advantages that would actually be reduced by the strategies you're suggesting. My response was polite but firm, establishing that I had independent expertise that didn't require family guidance. My mother's contribution to the conversation focused on emotional, rather than technical arguments. We're not trying to interfere with your decisions, honey, but we're worried about the stress and isolation that comes with managing significant wealth independently. Having family members involved in major financial decisions provides emotional support and helps ensure you're not making choices based on grief or overwhelm, rather than clear thinking. Her suggestion that my inheritance decisions might be compromised by grief was particularly frustrating because it ignored the months of careful consideration I'd given to family dynamics and financial responsibility. The implication that I needed family oversight to make sound decisions was consistent with lifelong patterns of underestimating my capabilities and treating my judgment as suspect. "Mom, I understand your concern," I said, "but I'm actually feeling more clear-headed about finances and family relationships than I have in years. Grandma Maggie's inheritance has given me the resources and independence to make decisions based on my values rather than financial necessity, which is exactly the kind of clarity she hoped I would gain." Their continued insistence that family involvement would improve my decision-making revealed the same fundamental misunderstanding that Jessica and Tyler had demonstrated about the nature of my changed circumstances. They were approaching me as the same person who had previously needed their guidance and approval, rather than recognizing that inheriting substantial wealth had shifted our relationship dynamics in ways that required adjusted expectations and boundaries. The most significant test of my ability to maintain healthy boundaries came when my father experienced a genuine financial emergency that required immediate assistance. His insurance agency faced a major liability claim that threatened both his business and personal assets, creating circumstances where family financial help could prevent serious economic hardship rather than simply enabling lifestyle preferences. "Emma, I need to ask for your help with something serious," he said during a phone call that came 3 weeks after our unsuccessful financial planning meeting. "The business is facing a lawsuit that could destroy everything I've built over 30 years. I need access to $50,000 for legal fees and potential settlement costs, and I need it quickly to prevent losing the agency." His request was different from Jessica's wedding funding or my parents' earlier attempts to gain influence over my financial decisions because it addressed genuine crisis rather than desired lifestyle enhancement. The amount was substantial but represented a small fraction of my inheritance, and the purpose was clearly legitimate rather than manipulative or self-serving. "Tell me more about the situation," I said, recognizing that this might be inappropriate use of Grandma Maggie's resources to support family members facing genuine hardship. "What kind of liability claim, and what are the potential outcomes if you can't access the funds you need?" My questions were designed to understand the situation fully before making decisions about assistance. My father explained that a client's insurance claim had been mishandled due to an administrative error in his office, resulting in significant financial losses that the client was seeking to recover through litigation against his agency. The mistake was genuine rather than intentional, but the potential damages exceeded his professional liability coverage and threatened both his business operations and personal assets that were tied to the agency. "I've spoken with attorneys who believe we can settle this case for around $40,000, which would allow me to keep the business operating and avoid personal bankruptcy," he continued. "Without that settlement option, we're looking at extended litigation that could cost even more and might result in judgments that force me to sell everything I've worked for." His explanation revealed genuine vulnerability that contrasted sharply with the calculated manipulation I'd experienced from other family members seeking access to my inheritance. This was a father facing the potential loss of his life's work due to circumstances that were serious and largely beyond his control, rather than someone seeking funding for lifestyle choices they couldn't afford independently. "Dad, I want to help you protect the business and avoid losing everything you've built," I said, recognizing that this situation aligned with Grandma Maggie's intentions about using wealth to support family members facing genuine need rather than manufactured want. "Let me review the legal documentation and speak with your attorneys to understand the situation completely, and then we can discuss appropriate assistance." My willingness to help with his genuine crisis while maintaining due diligence about the details demonstrated the kind of principled decision-making that Grandma Maggie had trusted me to exercise. Unlike the immediate emotional reactions that Jessica and Tyler had expected, I was prepared to provide substantial assistance for legitimate needs while maintaining accountability and transparency standards that protected both my resources and family relationships. The process of evaluating my father's legal situation and providing appropriate financial assistance taught me valuable lessons about distinguishing between manipulation and genuine need, between enabling and supporting, between family obligation and personal choice. These experiences were preparing me for the long-term role of family financial steward that Grandma Maggie had envisioned when she structured her inheritance to concentrate resources with the family member most likely to use them wisely and generously. As autumn progressed into winter, I found myself settling into new patterns of family interaction that reflected our evolved relationships and my growing confidence in managing both wealth and boundaries. Jessica and Tyler ultimately planned a modest wedding funded by their own resources, discovering in the process that smaller celebrations could be more meaningful than expensive productions that required financial assistance from others. My parents gradually adjusted to relating to me as an independent adult whose financial decisions deserved respect rather than oversight, though this adjustment required ongoing conversations about boundaries and expectations that tested their ability to change deeply ingrained interaction patterns. Most importantly, I began developing charitable giving strategies that honored Grandma Maggie's values while creating positive impact in areas that mattered to both of us. Her wealth became a tool for supporting animal welfare organizations, providing veterinary scholarships for students from modest backgrounds, and contributing to community programs that helped elderly residents maintain independence and dignity. The family burden had indeed inherited everything, but more significantly, I had inherited the responsibility and opportunity to transform family wealth into a force for positive change that would honor Grandma Maggie's memory while creating the kind of life and relationships that reflected our shared values of merit, generosity, and genuine care for others. Standing in what had once been Grandma Maggie's kitchen and was now mine, I understood that her final gift hadn't been money or property, but the chance to build authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence or emotional manipulation. The inheritance had given me the power to choose how and when to support family members, but more importantly, it had given me the freedom to insist on relationships that brought out the best in everyone involved. The will reading that had begun, with Jessica calling me a family burden, had revealed that the real burden had been carried by someone who recognized my worth when others couldn't see beyond their own assumptions and preferences. Now it was my turn to use that recognition wisely, building a legacy that would make Grandma Maggie proud while creating the kind of family relationships she had always hoped we might develop. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.